equity training, and today we will be recording the session, excluding the Q&A components, so that you feel comfortable in sharing and asking any questions openly amongst your peers. And then after the training, we'll be able to share out the presentation and recording to you to share with your partners, and then we'll also post it online as well. So welcome, everyone. So today we will be focusing on what is equity, why is it important, how to create internal equity readiness. After that, we'll have a brief Q&A portion, and then we'll go into discussing how to incorporate equity into safe routes to parks. And then we will have a final Q&A section. Just for those that don't know, I am Danielle Sherman. I'm the Healthy Parks and Places Manager with the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, who's working with you wonderful folks that are creating safe and equitable access to parks. And my colleague, Marisa, you want to say hello if you can? If not, she did say hello in the chat box. I just want to be there.
Hi, everyone. Marisa Jones from the Safe Routes to School National Partnership here, calling in from Philadelphia.
Thanks, Marisa. And then today we will be co-presenting with WeCollab, and we'll be co-presenting specifically with Samia Mirza. And I just wanted to share a little bit about her before we proceed. She's the managing director of WeCollab. She serves as the project co-director there. She has 10 years of experience spanning across multiple industries in project management, management consulting, and training. As the managing director, she leads national policy and advocacy technical assistance projects that impact the lives of children. Samia was previously the director of programs and operations for Leadership Houston. So shout out to Can Do Houston, who is a grantee of ours, a nonprofit focused on civic engagement and training. At Leadership Houston, Samia developed the organization's core leadership curriculum and redesigned a 30-year-old program to include metrics, processes, and implementation plans. Samia has also led international health projects in West Africa, where she worked with a coalition of international surgeons and local community members to hold surgical camps and courses. She earned her MBA from Rice University and her undergraduate degree in business administration and sales from the University of Houston. And Samia also holds the project management professional certification. So please welcome Samia. I will now go to next time. So before we switch over to Samia, which will talk more about what is equity and being having internal capacity to do equity work externally, I just wanted to kind of ground all of us in this equity manifesto, which is from PolicyLink. And PolicyLink is a national research and action institute that advances racial and economic equity. So it begins by joining together, believing in the potency of inclusion and building from a common bond. It embraces complexity as cause for collaboration, accepting that our fates are inextricable. It recognizes local leaders as national leaders, nurturing the wisdom and creativity within every community as essential to solving the nation's problems. It demands honesty and forthrightness, calling out racism and oppression, both overt and systemic. It strives for the power to realize our goals while summoning the grace to sustain them. It recognizes that we understand the past without being trapped in it, embrace the present without being constrained by it, and look to the future guided by the hopes and courage of those who have fought before and beside us. This is equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in all of us, or in us all. I'm going to turn it over now to Samia to share more about what equity is, and again, how to incorporate or to how to determine your internal capacity or readiness to do this work externally. Thanks, Samia.
Thank you, Danielle. Hello, everybody. Happy to be joining you all. Today we will be diving into what equity is, why is it important, and then how your team and organization can be prepared internally to execute on an equity strategy. So to level set before we get started, I know that you are on this call because of your work specifically with Safe Routes to Parks, and that the presentation today will be relevant to your initiative. However, an equity strategy is larger than just one project, and my hope is that you will take away this information today that can be applied to your organization as a whole, which will also make it easier for you to apply an equity lens to your work, specifically on the Safe Routes to Parks. So in our discussion, you may hear me reference you as an organization, or you may also hear me reference you as an initiative, but either way, this information is applicable. Also, I know that some of you may already know this information or have some understanding of it, but I hope that everyone is still able to walk away and learn something new today. So with that, what is equity? Danielle has already gone through a great breakdown from Policy Link on the Equity Manifesto and provided their definition of equity. Trying to define equity is a bit more challenging than you would expect. There are, in fact, many different definitions of equity, each with a different perspective and a different focus. I would argue, however, that the exact definition of equity is less important than what you actually do with that information. For the purposes of today, I want to give you guys two additional definitions. First is from the World Health Organization, which defines it as the absence of avoidable or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically. The key focus here is, in this definition, is on the absence of avoidable remediable differences, meaning disparities. That is, disparities in health, transportation, job access, salaries, etc. All of these disparities can be fixed or avoided, as they are oftentimes created due to policy and environments. The second definition here is by Wu Li, who's an excellent public health blogger. He says that equity is about ensuring the communities most affected by injustice get the most money to lead in the fight to address that injustice. And if that means we break the rules to make that happen, then that's what we have to do. Personally, this is one of my favorite definitions in that it gets to the real life implementation of an equity-centric policy. So Vu here is focusing on how resources are distributed. A core aspect of equity is being able to provide people and communities with the resources and tools they need. It is safe to say that more often than not, the people that have the greatest inequities have the greatest need for resources to correct them. This is the basis of targeted universalism, which we aren't going to get into today, but if you are not aware of that concept or that framework, I definitely encourage you all to research it and read through it. Below that is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's infographic on how to distinguish between equality and equity. You may have seen some of those pictures with the people standing on the boxes in front of the fence. Well, this is the upgraded or newer version of that picture. As you can see in the top, equality is about giving everyone the same bike or resource, regardless of if that bike leads to an equal outcome or equal opportunity. Each person does have a bike, but that doesn't mean they each have an equal ability or equal opportunity to ride that bike. In the bottom, you'll see that each person is given a different type or size of bike. So this is equity. The young lady in the wheelchair has been given a whole new type of bike or resource that she can actually use, and the gentleman has been given a bike with a higher seat and higher handlebars, which allows each of them to have the opportunity for an equal outcome. Equity then, in a very, very simple sense, is the opportunity to be equal. And in a complex sense, it is all the different things that need to be affected and changed to create that opportunity to be equal. Next slide, please. So achieving equity. When we talk about achieving equity, for one, I want to note that there is not going to ever be a time where we say, well, equity has been achieved, we can all pack our bags and go home, we're done and done here. Equity work is ever going, but we all have the ability to decrease those inequities, and we all have the ability to impact it. So some of these were also included in the Equity Manifesto that was shared earlier, but I do want to point out a couple of things that I feel are important to your work in the Safe Routes to Parks initiative. When we talk about root causes, so in the first couple of bullets here, we talk about root causes and major obstacles that groups have faced we must realize that people in the communities are working and have a much more vivid memory and intimate understanding of injustices in their community than we do as practitioners. This means that we have to do our research to understand the history of the area you are working in, including the social history as well as the political history. You always want to be able to add value and be a value add in a community, and having that historical perspective helps you to do that. It gives you better context for the needs of the community and root causes of issues that you may be able to address in your work. Not only must you do the research, but you also have to acknowledge the history as well. If you address it up front, you will be received much better and be able to build better relationships. In order to build community champions, which we all know is very important in our work, you must show solidarity. And to show solidarity, you must acknowledge the historical injustices. You can't show up in a community that has previous trauma and historical injustices and not acknowledge it. And then the last two bullets here really talk about, again, directing resources to the high need areas. I know your process for selecting parks to build routes definitely considers high need, but I encourage you to take this lens in all of your work. The only way your work will actually move the needle in disparities is if your focus and your efforts are in the needs that have, or are in the areas that have the greatest needs. So why is equity actually important? I want to go deeper in talking about the inequities that exist today and why working to decrease those disparities is so important. Next slide. So this chart, I know there's a lot of facts here and a lot of information which you can digest more closely later. But what we're looking at here is that one of the greatest impacts that your work at Safe Routes has is on the health of the community. This data specifically was pulled from CDC and compiled by Families USA. On the left side are health stats of Latino adults and children as compared to non-Hispanic white adults and children. And on the right side are the health stats of African American adults and children as compared to that of non-Hispanic white adults and children. As you can see, there are big health disparities here in our population. So if you look on the Latino side, they are 2 times more likely to have asthma. They are 15% more likely to have liver disease, 15% increase in obesity. Looking here a little closer, 65% more likely to be diabetic. If we look at the African American side, there's 20% chance for less likely to receive treatment for depression. They're 40% more likely to be obese. 40% more likely to die of breast cancer. And so these are in the adults, and then the children statistics are on the bottom as well. 35% more likely to be obese on the Latino side, and 73% more likely to be obese on the African American side. So these disparities are due to policies, community development, food availability, and a whole host of other environmental factors. And the disparities are not because Latinos or African Americans are inherently unhealthy. This is a product of structural inequalities. This is how the laws and policies created over the years end up playing out. And this is also why Safe Routes to Parks is so important. The health outcomes will get worse unless there is intentionality in how our communities are built, including the safe routes that lead to parks that you all are working on. So by no means are you going to be able to solve all of these different health disparities and all of these different health issues here. But what you can do is, with a very intentional focus on the communities that have the greatest need, and having that equity lens, you can actually move the needle on some of these health inequities. When it comes to transportation, similarly, we can see that disparities exist in transportation as well. So if we look at the slide, and I know the numbers are a little hard to see here, but people killed while walking based on income, in low-income communities, they are 2 times more likely to be killed. Children that are killed while walking, African-American, are 2 times more likely. Latinos are 40% more likely. And when we look on the flip side over here with the physical environment, we can see that high-income communities, 90% of them have sidewalks, while low-income communities, only 49% of them have sidewalks. Now, while we can't fully attribute differences in injury and fatality deaths to the differences in availability of sidewalks, we can definitely see that there is an impact and a correlation there. Again, this illustrates how the difference in physical environment leads to differences in outcomes. And our impact and our intentionality can be in those physical environments to be able to change those outcomes. Labor force. So this chart is showing us that in 1994, we had only 3 different generations working in the labor force. In 2017, we had 5 different generations represented in the workforce. And this is because, again, a lot of different factors, but predominantly younger, predominantly people are entering the workforce younger and also remaining in the workforce much later in their careers and much later in age. If you take a look at the millennials and post-millennials in the right-hand bar, they make up about 40% of the workforce. These 2 groups are more diverse than any other generation ever was. The baby boomer generation, for example, is 27% white, while the millennial generation is 21% white, and post-millennial is 19% white. And that's going to keep progressing in that manner. So what this is showing us is that our working society is changing. More and more people of color make up our labor force, which means what happens in these communities has a direct impact on our economy and on our labor force. Again, making it much more apparent that we need to be focusing on these communities for the larger equity implications. So we've discussed what equity is and why it is important. Now I want to focus on how your team can prepare itself to implement an equity strategy. Again, we look at this from a macro perspective of your organization, and we can also look at it from the micro perspective of Safe Routes to Parks initiative. Relatively speaking, the Safe Routes grant may be a small portion of your budget. However, I encourage you to take the opportunity to dig deeper with your colleagues at the organizational level. So we know based on our conversation so far that equity requires us to understand historical context, to identify those with the greatest need, and then provide the necessary resources and tools for that community. An equity strategy is not a clear framework or a single silver bullet. It's actually many small activities or considerations or actions that when combined create that equity strategy. You can even call it a lens, an equity lens on the work you are already doing. For example, when we look at this diagram here, it looks similar to any organizational planning tool. However, we use this as a tool to create your equity lens, to create that equity strategy. So if we look at the assessment portion, assessing and inventorying of your organization, you would actually assess your staff's equity training needs, their ability to communicate with communities, or you would assess your partner list and ensure there is representation. The training phase, you would develop training that allows staff to have proximity to the community they are working in. Training that is around implicit bias or historical context of the community. When developing the strategy, you would ensure that your initiative strategy is focused on the communities that need it the most. And for external commitment, you would ensure that your messaging is clear in its commitment to the communities, and that you are clearly identifying that you you're supporting an equity perspective on your work. And Danielle will be going over how equity activities or an equity lens can be included in the action framework later in this presentation. But the action framework that you all use in your Safe Routes to Park initiative can have this equity overlay incorporated into that. So our argument is that you must first take an introspective look at your organization and set it up with an equity lens. As the internal work is being done, your external equity activities will come much more naturally, and it will all make a lot more sense. So this is a list of questions for you and your organization to explore. This is like taking a pressure check. Where's your organization or project team on each of these questions? Equity is about intentionality, and without taking the time to actually discuss and contemplate these questions, your work will likely not have the intended impact on disparities. So let's take a look at a few of these questions. So first we have, does your organization have an internal definition of equity or defined health equity values? As we talked about earlier, the definition as a whole may not be so important, and sometimes organizations get caught up in wordsmithing and perfecting this definition. When I say definition, I'm really talking more about what are your values around equity, and how does that become a center North Star for your organization. So the values may be about the communities you serve, about the type of communication. It might be that you focus on, certain high need. And so these are just the different types of values that you have that the organization can come back to. Do your partners display the ability to move an equity agenda forward? So also taking a look at who are we partnering with? Does that help us move our equity agenda? And also for that organization, are they also on the same page as us? Are they also working in the same communities we are with the same type of intentionality that we are? What are internal policies and statements that your organization has made to articulate the equity strategies? So this is both internally and also externally. What policies have you already identified? What statements have you made that lets your staff know that this is our stance on equity, this is how we work, and this is how you will be supported in implementing those policies. Going to the next slide here, there's a few more questions. Who within your team is responsible for leading the charge of equity? While we want equity to be embedded throughout your organization and not as a standalone silo, right? We're not necessarily saying that equity happens in one silo, but we do feel it's really important to have one point person or a group of people that are responsible for it, that are constantly saying, hey, folks in communication, did you think about this type of publication or this perspective to include in your communication? Or hey, folks in grants, did you think of these organizations to partner with or these organizations to grant with? So it's really about having somebody that's always keeping it top of mind for everybody else. And then what type of trainings are in place that allow your team members to embrace equity strategies? We talk about this a lot, that you don't know what you don't know. And a lot of times we tell staff like, hey, this is equity, go do it. And then they don't know what that means, or they don't know how to implement it. Or digging deeper past just operationalizing it, what are the different factors that impact equity, such as implicit bias, or understanding historical context of policies and communities, and how does that impact our work? So really taking the time to embrace these trainings for staff. So these are just some questions for you. Obviously, these are much deeper questions that take a lot of work with your team, but I really do encourage you, either at your initiative level with Safe Parks, you can take a look at this, but a lot of these are really deeper conversations with your organization. And there's not really right or wrong answers to this, and there's not just one answer. It's really about how does your organization take this, how do they view equity, and how do they really incorporate it into each of these aspects. So I do encourage you to take this back and do this exercise with your organization. And then this last piece here, you know, a lot of times equity is a big and complex topic, and to develop the strategies can take some time, but I do want to leave you with 4 action steps that you can take right now that you can really start thinking through. So the first is to review the mission, vision, and objectives of your organization and project to ensure equity alignment. So here again, really taking a look at, does our organization's objectives, visions really align with serving the people most in need and removing the barriers to equity? All of those different things that we talked about in that equity manifesto, really, does our organization align with that? So the action step here is to review that. And if you can't do it at the organizational level, at least at your project level, does your project mission and vision align with that manifesto? Second, to develop metrics or benchmarks that measure equity impact or equity activities. You know, what in your project can you measure? How many people are you involving? How many different voices are around the table? What kind of partnerships do you have? What kind of training are you providing? And then building out really those long-term metrics as well around how many more people are coming to the park, how many different types of people are coming to the park. What is the implication around the amount of infrastructure funds that go into the community after your project is over? Those are the types of metrics that you can be measuring. And of course, for each of your projects and each of your organizations, those would be different. But what we're encouraging is you identify them and start measuring them. Then research the history and current day intersectional issues that impact the neighborhood in which your project is being implemented. This really goes back to our conversation around understanding the historical context and understanding who you're working with and what they've gone through already. So again, if you've already identified the communities that you're working in for safe routes, or when you do identify those communities, really taking that time and making that a part of your planning process is to do that research, both for history and what are the intersectional issues that can impact the work as well. And then last is review your list of partners to ensure there's representation of community members and relevant intersectional topics. And the key here is representation, making sure that there are different voices heard, different age groups, different socioeconomic status, different types of leaders in the community, and then also the intersectional topics. What are the intersectional issues, and then who represents them? How can we bring them to the table and work with them as we're going forward in our project here? And so before I open it up to some questions here, I just want to say, you know, Safe Routes to Parks is actually an interesting initiative in that not only are you all working on park access, you all are working on it in high-need neighborhoods. That's already built into the work of Safe Routes to Parks, which is phenomenal and it's great. But what that does is it sometimes makes it easy for us to jump to the assumption that that our initiative is already doing the equity work, that because of the nature of the initiative, our equity work is done. However, equity is really about intentionality. And we do not just want to put a path in a neighborhood. We want to create a pathway that is truly beneficial to the community, that takes into account their needs, that empowers them. Equity is actually not an organic process. Really, it does take vigilance and effort and thought. And I hope that you'll take that time and effort in your project here with Safe Routes. So we will have some time at the end to go into some deep questions, but I want to give you the opportunity, if anybody has any initial questions that are jumping out at you, I'm happy to take those.
So let's get ready to talk about incorporating equity into safe routes to parks. So what we will be doing is really looking at the action framework and looking at ways that we can incorporate equity. Now, these are just some suggestions to help guide that process. These are not it's not a whole comprehensive list of everything, but it just really gives us a start to this conversation. And Marisa and I on the TA calls with you all will be digging deeper during our June and July calls on, kind of helping to move equity along in the work that you're currently doing. All right, so we're going to start off with incorporating equity into engagement. We know that engagement is a means of addressing equity. It's one of the 5 stages, and it's embedded into each one of the stages. So if we're looking at engagement, we have the community collaborations broadly, and then we also have partner coalitions, which you all are working with. But first, we're going to talk about community collaborations. So our real call to action with community collaborations is really to develop authentic relationships with community residents that live within the neighborhood of focus that you're working on, and include people from underrepresented or high need populations throughout the entire process. This will also include involving, or even if possible, having residents really lead that decision making that's going forth in terms of creating safe and equitable access to parks. Some of you may be familiar with the community engagement spectrum. It is adapted from the International Association for Public Participation. And this came from the Collective Impact Forum Community Engagement Toolkit. So engagement is obviously most robust on the right side of the diagram. It's underneath empowering or collaborating and empowering, where the sole purpose, the sole decision-making authority falls within the community residents in terms of what programs or services or physical environmental changes that exist there. And then on the far left-hand side is more informing. So just so you understand, this can also be read as a spectrum between buy-in as well as ownership. So buy-in on the left-hand side of the spectrum in terms of informing, where you're providing more information to community residents. And then on the right-hand side, where you're getting more ownership because they're the ones who are making the decisions for things that occur in their community. So again, on the left side, we are often mobilizing people to support or provide limited input or feedback to our decisions. And then on the right side, we are organizing people to identify their interests and assets. So in essence, they're becoming the deciders, the outcome producers, the advocates, the leaders. And it's definitely about shifting power to the community when you look at the right-hand side of the spectrum. It is not always necessary, appropriate, or even within your capacity to practice collaborative or empowering approaches, but we really encourage you to push your assumptions and your comfort level to move as far right as appropriate. And so moving to the right means, in essence, giving up power, because the work is not about our power, but it's more about the community results. It is essential that wherever you are on the spectrum, that you are very clear about it and transparent about it, about your position, and fulfill that promise of where you're at with the community. The greatest tensions really tend to come when we're not really open and transparent about it, and we might say we want it to be more collaborative and empowering, but then we're delivering an informing and consulting level of work. So if you aspire to more engagement, communicate that, and then take clear steps that demonstrate your commitment is real. And it is also important to be very transparent about how much power you're willing to give away or not. And now we're talking about, okay, so how does this look? So these are just some questions that you can bring back to your coalition in terms of figuring out your community engagement strategy, and we'll also talk about these on our TA calls. So some things to think about in terms of how to move through the continuum of creating authentic community engagement are, where are you currently on this community engagement spectrum, and where do you aspire to be? And then looking at what steps will it take to pursue that level of engagement, and what power or control you might need to give up. Maybe looking at what work you might need to slow down or trade off in the short term in order to advance community engagement. So for example, if you were initially thinking, okay, we're gonna do 3 early actions, noting that you only have to do 1 as with requirements, but you may say, okay, like if we want to make sure that we're developing authentic relationships and really helping to support community residents to be decision makers, we might need to slow down and focus more on the engagement and then assessment piece along with the planning piece involving community residents, giving that more time and maybe just focusing on 1 early action. So you just kind of look at things that you might need to slow down or trade off in the effort of creating authentic community engagement. Then also thinking about how do you ensure that your community engagement is advancing your results. So I think Samia went over some things that you might want to think of in terms of your evaluation. So quantitatively, you can also look at the number of folks that show up to your meetings, your community engagement meetings, but then also maybe on your partner coalition, asking specific questions to the community residents of how has their experience been involved in creating safe and equitable access on the partner coalition. So you want to look at quantitative, but also qualitative, but it's always good to make sure you're monitoring that, the relationship and community engagement throughout the process, as well as at the end. All right, so now we're going to talk about partner coalitions. So I hope that it's been clear through our calls that you can either develop a coalition or you can engage with an existing coalition of community partners. Here we really just want to stress, if you are developing a coalition, or even if you have an existing coalition, you might want to think to make sure that you kind of have these organizations present in your coalition. So looking at, do you have representation from those that are underrepresented or high need populations, including youth? Are you working with organizations that currently work on park access with neighborhoods? If there's a park foundation that's in your area, that might be a good organization to work with. Then an organization that serves the specific geographic neighborhood that you're working with. And then an organization that's most trusted by community residents of the neighborhood. So say you had a predominantly Native American community, maybe there might have been like a Native American cultural group that meets consistently and that's well connected to the community that you're looking to serve, that you can get involved, that they can be a part of the coalition to move the work forward. So this is just noting that you really need to have a partner coalition and that there has to be a diversity on there. And these are some of the key areas that you can look at. And to delve into this even a little bit deeper, great. So we have a coalition table going on right now. So we're looking at who is around that coalition table, understanding who is on your coalition, and these ways can really help you to identify what strengths and gaps you have in terms of experience and context expertise about the intended beneficiaries, the issues, and the neighborhoods that you're serving. So if we're looking at these 4 areas, and you're thinking about the coalition that you are working with currently to create safe and equitable access to parks, how many of those people on your team, and this is rhetorical, how many people on your team have been directly impacted by the issue? So we're talking about safe and equitable access. Is there anyone on your team that has been directly impacted by this issue? Then we want to look at demographic relevance. So how many people on your team are demographically reflect the target population? So if, like I mentioned before, if your community is predominantly made up of Native American individuals, do you have representation from that demographic at your coalition table? Direct engagement, how many people work directly or indirectly with the target population that you're looking at? And then geographic relevance. Now, this one might sometimes be difficult. Some people might feel it might be difficult, but how many people on your team grew up in or actually live in the neighborhood you're serving? So that's why it's very important to have and engage folks that live within the community that you're working with, because that would help you to ensure that you are hearing their lived experiences and that their identification of the needs are being met, and that they can actually really help to lead the decisions for change in the community in which they actually live in. All right, and then the last part for community engagement, and let me say one more thing about what I was just talking about. If you realize, if the majority of your team is really not captured here, you really need to address equity at your coalition table. And your need for community engagement is really more acute. So what we'll be working with you through the TA calls is really identifying, do you feel that you have the right mix of organizations and people involved to really understand the population you're working with, the issue at hand of safe and equitable access to parks, and neighborhoods that you're working with. And if you don't feel that way, we'll talk about steps that we can work on to really narrow those gaps. Right, and so some community engagement fundamentals related to overall community collaborations as well as partner coalitions. Many of these you probably are familiar with already, just making sure that the meeting times are times that fit for community residents to be a part, so probably having them in the evening, not in the middle of the day. Meeting locations are the locations within the community themselves, the venues. Some folks may not feel comfortable going to a city building. Are there some cultural centers that you can have your meetings at? Really focusing on meeting the residents where they are. Then looking at the formatting, content of the communication that you're sharing. Is it in the language that your population speaks? Is the formatting and even the content there very concise and clear to the population as well? And so this also goes to, like, if you have a partner coalition that includes community residents, you have like a direct link to, and of course you can't, one person can't represent a whole population, but you have some inkling of some of these if they're relevant to that population. Then looking at accommodations, whether you're offering transportation, food, childcare, translation, and signers for those that need those services. All right, so now incorporating equity into assessment. Just like we were talking about before, we want to make sure that you're involving residents in every phase of the Safe Routes to Parks action framework, and this is no different. So we want to involve residents and youth, including youth, in assessment activities. And so, for example, we have, I think it's Seattle. The city of Seattle, they were partnering with organizations that were embedded within their community to determine community needs and priorities. And through that, they established their Get Moving Fund, where they really supported local nonprofit organizations, small businesses, and community groups in offering innovative and culturally relevant events and/or projects to increase participation in community sports and recreation that really serve the under-resourced communities. And when they worked with the community organizations, through examining the needs and priorities before they established that fund, they identified the correlation between race, poverty, and obesity. And so they were able to really hone in on what communities needed the most support in terms of where they put their resources in. And also related to youth engagement in Portland, and I know we have Verde on the call, so feel free to chime in the chat box if you want to add anything, but their Portland Parks and Rec, they have a youth ambassador program that has hired high school and college age youth from more than 10 different ethnic groups to work within their community. They're called community youth ambassadors, and they advocate, organize, and engage youth and families who are really new to the Portland community, and help them help the Parks and Rec to really identify the barriers and challenges related to parks services for those new Portlanders. And so that the ambassadors really collaborate with partner organizations to improve programs and services within the city and beyond. And they also at the same time are learning valuable skills. So it's almost like, okay, yes, they're helping in assessment and identifying various barriers and challenges, but they are also developing their leadership as well at the same time. So awesome effort. Next, understanding the community's context. Samia mentioned that community's context is so important. If you, like we mentioned before, those 4 areas, if you don't live in the community or grew up in the community, and even I would say really live in the community because communities change, but you can understand the historical context if you grew up there, then you can kind of miss things in terms of when you're going to develop your priorities and your strategies. And just to give you an example, when we were working, we had a request for from a Portland nonprofit to do a blog on the Safe Routes to Parks Activating Communities program. And they wanted us to talk about the program and then mention Verde, since that was the community, the grantee that was in their community. And so we wrote up this blog and then we shared it with Verde. And they were like, you know, the part of it I'm going to talk about is we wrote in terms of things that this effort was doing was addressing blighted properties and dumping. And Verde came back and they were like, you know, could we instead of using the word blighted, use disinvested? And they shared that the term blighted was historically used by the Portland Development Commission to justify the displacement of Black residents from their blighted homes in the Albina neighborhood for the sake of building I-5, which is a highway, and the Emmanuel Hospital. And so it was just like another thing, like you really need the context that only comes from those that live in the community or work in the community that you're trying to support. So it wouldn't have been like the end of the world, but it could have been for some community resident that would have read that and felt very much offended. So understanding the context of a community and the history behind things is very important and something that should be done early on. Next, collecting and analyzing data to account for various types of diversity within a community, including qualitative data about community perceptions of park access. Just another reminder that quantitative data is very much important, but also lived experiences is equally important and should be captured as well. Because even if it's not something that's real and could be supported by data, it's perceived, and that alone can stop someone from wanting to access the park. Lastly, in terms of equity into assessment, you can conduct a policy scan of transportation and park policies and or practices related to safe routes to parks. And just those are some examples there: complete streets, Vision Zero, parks and recreation plans and budgets, and comprehensive plans, and look at the negative effects to low income and communities of color. All right, so incorporating equity into planning. So it's very important to use data from assessment that we just talked about to drive the priorities and investments around safe routes to parks, really ensuring that lived experiences are incorporated alongside quantitative data. And just to give you an example, in Portland, the Portland Parks and Recs, they developed a racial equity plan, and their plan uses a data-driven equity framework so that they can make sure they're more accountable for their efforts. And they established the Parks, Race, and Ethnicity Project that collects accurate information concerning communities of color, immigrants, and refugees, and has served as an integral assessment tool for them. That is called PREP, that's the acronym for it, was created to better understand who is currently using the services of the Parks and Recs department. And by understanding that, the Bureau was better able to assess its performance in serving all, the population. So they use the data to be able to know how to proceed in terms of what should their priorities be and where should they make their investments. Next, it's important to develop targeted policies and solutions for communities that need the most support. Again, just making sure that your policies, when you're, a policy that was developed for a community that is predominantly white and affluent might not work for a community that is low-income community, community of color. So, I mean, you might be able to use the base of it and make some adjustments, but just realizing that, and this should go for any community that you would work in, that you want to make sure that you're developing policies and solutions that are specific to them, and that comes from having the data, the actual numbers, and the lived experiences to develop those. All right, and so then we'll talk about developing strategies to minimize the negative impacts of planned efforts. So that is something, so once you've developed your targeted policies and solutions, it's almost like you need to kind of step back, literally, and look at those policies and solutions and say, okay, how could this possibly almost backfire on us? So look at it from different angles. And now that doesn't mean that you're going to realize everything up front, but it is helpful to kind of step back to see ways that you can determine, are there strategies that we can put in place, or are there adjustments to the policies and solutions we want to do that will not have a negative impact on planned efforts. And so, for example, like if there are codes, if codes are changed through policy, some parks may not be able to meet those new requirements due to funding and resources, and therefore they might face like closures, or just like the quality of the park will go down. So, you could think about how to maybe reallocate funds to support that policy change, or you might just need to adjust the targeted policy once you look back and say, okay, this is going to require some funding to do so. And then reallocating funds to address solutions and invest in communities that need the most support. And for this, so there's an example in Minneapolis. So Minneapolis Parks and Rec, back in December 2016, they adopted their newest annual budget. And for the first time, they utilized this equity matrix that I can share later to select capital improvement projects in neighborhood parks. So for example, they looked at two things, like community characteristics, and some examples that fell underneath that was like racially concentrated areas of poverty, and did it also align with youth populations. And then they looked at park characteristics. So they looked at park asset conditions and then park asset lifespan. And then it was like out of a total score of 23 for each of those big component areas. And that's how they determined where funds were going to go. So that's like a very objective way of looking at where the funds are needed the most, and incorporating it into your budget. So that's a great example. And also with Minneapolis, they also looked at their budget process and now require that each new request or potential budget cut be viewed through an equity lens. All right, and so the last one for equity into planning is looking at building capacity of residents to advocate for the desired changes that they want. So what trainings can you offer to support residents in feeling comfortable and having the skill to be able to testify at council meetings on the changes that they want to see? All right. Now, incorporating equity into implementation, involving residents, including youth in implementation activities such as installing and constructing new features, and maintaining the park and surrounding street through adopt a park maintenance groups. And you can also work with your neighboring schools to get them involved. And I think I shared, I don't know if I shared through another training or just with one, with Health by Design, who's in Indianapolis, but they had, in Columbia, they had it where the school they were involving the school in making the actual feature change, which I believe was a crosswalk. And so the students got out and we're going to be working on that implementation activity. Also focusing on making sure to schedule these implementation activities if you want to make sure that residents can be involved during the times that work best for community residents. Also, again, around capacity, having training that which can be built in what we talked about previously, but for holding elected officials accountable for the plans they agreed on. So now that we're at implementation, we're basically saying that they agreed on these things to implement, and now we want to make sure that community residents can make sure that elected officials are being held to what they said. So having them have the capacity to be able to do that. And so training will probably be a great way to work on that. And then conducting activation activities to engage residents in the changed environment. That is, some examples of that could include community park watches, so like a neighborhood watch, but a park watch, community-led physical activity groups that are culturally appropriate. And a good idea is, the partner coalition that you have, or even other community organizations that you meet with, having them offer their services. If there might be an organization you're working with that has services that they could offer, whether it be Zumba or something else that would activate the community, and that way they are able to, they're within the community, they understand that context, and they also are being compensated for their efforts as well. And then also reach out to other community organizations to get their members involved. So like if they're local faith communities, neighborhood associations, or the local PTO or PTA, getting them involved by having their members coming out as well to help activate the space. All right, and finally, before we move into some more questions, incorporating equity into sustainability. So here we're really focusing on continuing to build authentic relationships that you develop during this project period, and supporting reciprocal activities with organizations that are focused on equity and that represent the community. So it's like not this project is not going to end, or this initiative is not going to end, and then we're going to say, okay, that's it, see you later to that coalition. That coalition really should be with you the rest of the time that you're working on anything. They should be your, together, your sidekick. So you can work on other initiatives together that might not even be related to parks, but I'm sure if it's related to their community, something that's going to be their community, that they would love to have that, to be have an have a sole decision authority in this process. So making sure that you really continue to build those relationships, and that building of the relationships really comes from working alongside with folks. It's not something that is just like, okay, I've talked to this person, I'm just going to talk to them so I could just make sure that we're all together. Yes, it is about talking and, learning about the person and the persons that you're working with. But as you're working on these actual efforts, you also tend to just build trust and develop authentic relationships that way as well. And then also supporting their activities. So these organizations that are a part of your efforts, they also have, programs that they might be working on that you can also show up and support in different ways as well. So that's also something to continue to focus on after the project period is over. Also offering residents, especially youth, opportunities to become champions for Safe Routes to Parks so that they can contribute their ideas and time. So there's initiatives that are called Friends of Park, or like Friends of, and then the name of your park, where that you have community residents, elected officials, and other community organizations that will really be focused on the budgeting of the park, other ways of sustaining it, maintaining it, the programming of it. So that is a nice component that you can add on and start even working on throughout. Right, I guess right now would be also helpful to work on that as you're developing your coalitions, because those folks can also be funneled into the Friends of Park as well if they're interested. Also, Adopt a Park maintenance groups are another great way to get folks involved and be a part of improving their park, and also create a nice ownership of their park and the neighboring areas. Continuing to build capacity of residents and partners with opportunities to learn and grow. So, for example, having training and skill building around equity. So you could even share this this training with your coalition or other partners, or you can even have us to do the training for you on a site visit, or even just virtually as well. Also, leadership trainings are helpful. And I know the two that come to mind, Environmental Health Coalition and Can Do Houston, that have leadership trainings that they have for their residents already. That's a great way to build the capacity of residents to be able to lead in identifying the needs of their communities and making the decisions for the changes that they want to see. Also noting that when you do that, making sure that those times for those trainings and skill building activities, that you're accounting for obstacles that may prevent some from attending. So for example, we were talking about the accommodations, so making sure that you might offer transportation or having childcare there or offering food, just so that you're really accounting for those obstacles that may prevent folks from actually participating. And then monitoring who is and isn't using or benefiting from the implemented changes, and then course correct as needed. So some things you might want to look at, qualitatively, you can ask, identify if the park leads to changes in demographics and gentrification due to increased investment in the community. Who is using the park? How has the environment around the park changed? How have the businesses around the park been affected? And so those are just some things you can look at as well in terms of monitoring who is and who is not using it or benefiting, and then go ahead and make changes. Now, at this point, you're probably towards the end of the project, but we would hope that these efforts are going to be incorporated into other agency, like partner efforts, or if you get grants to extend the work that you've done through this project. And then examining the budget to ensure that funds are being used to address community-specific needs of communities that need the most support. And we spoke about that before, just there are different prioritization tools now where you can really see what communities need the most support, and then that's where you would reallocate your funds to. Okay, so that was a lot of